Just wanted to welcome everybody. My name is Megan Stanley. I'm the Executive Director of the Pittsburgh Commission on Human Relations. Right now you can't see me because we have done a spotlight on the video of our ASL interpreter who we're very happy to have join us. So thank you, Bill. I just wanted to go over a couple of things to get everybody used to why we're here, what we're going to be talking about, and the nuts and bolts of the webinar. So again, thank you for taking time out of your workday. I know, especially for media professionals, you are all likely under deadlines and have stories to write. And we really appreciate people coming here to learn how to be better allies to diverse communities. And one of the things that I really want to call out as framing for why we're having this discussion today is, as you probably know, we are expecting the Supreme Court to issue a ruling probably in July, so in a very short time, around the cases that argued for the expansion of Title VII of Civil Rights Act. And that expansion would include undersex, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. And that expansion is really important. And so either way they rule, we know that there will be reporting around this, and we want to make sure that there's responsible reporting going on in the Pittsburgh community. So just one of the things to call out that's going to be upcoming and very important for this conversation. So if you have questions as Ciora Thomas, our presenter, goes through her presentation, please send those through the Q&A button, which should be at your bottom control bar. That will come to the panelists, we will see that, and then it will be visible if we accept the question. I'm going to ask people to obviously be respectful, be kind, don't use any hate speech. And if you have questions or don't know something, please feel free to ask that. I believe that we've disabled the chat just to minimize chatter, but if you do have any questions, please let us know. I believe that you can also raise your hand if you need to as an attendee. You can change the view that you have if you want to go up, and we have a screenshot of it here. You can go up to view options, click on that, and then click side-by-side mode if you want to be able to see the interpreter and the presenter. Otherwise, as I said, we have the spotlight on the interpreter, and we will be sharing the screen throughout the time that the presentation is happening, and then we will be in video mode for the panel that will be the second half of this webinar. Again, any questions, let us know, and I'm going to turn it over to our presenters who are so happy to have Ciora Thomas of Sisters PGH, as well as many, many other organizations, including the Transgender Coalition of Pennsylvania.
So just reiterating with Megan had mentioned, I want to thank all of our media personnel for being here with us today to learn these essential things and how to support our trans communities, trans and non-binary communities. I just want to go over quickly what we will be going through today. So we're going to be discussing lived experience of trans and non-binary people, defining gender, gender myths, the importance, let me move my, the importance and use of pronouns in gendered language, media portrayal of trans and non-binary people, tips for reporting and interviewing, and we'll also be discussing being an ally or an accomplice for trans and non-binary folk. And we can go to the next slide. Of course, with any training, we definitely want to go over some community agreements here. And I'll go over these. So like Megan had mentioned, respect, right? Give undivided attention to the person who has the floor. Not a non-judgmental approach. We can disagree with one another, with another person's point of view without putting that person down. To diversity. We will remember that people in the group may differ in cultural background, sexual orientation, or gender identity, or gender expression, and we'll be careful about making insensitive or careless remarks. Step up and step back. This is a tool for thinking about the ways that our participation in classes is often shaped by how we benefit from or do not benefit from social relations of power. This asks us to pay attention to how frequently, how long, and how quickly we participate so that we can check our own over participation and step back, or we can notice how we don't take up space and make an attempt to step up and make our voices heard, especially when we may not often do that. Next slide. So now we're just going to jump right into lived experience. And these are the experiences of trans people. And we put this in here because a lot of times the media doesn't get a chance to really understand what trans and non-binary people are experiencing within community and how we are navigating within community. So we wanted to give you some background, just a little background on what's happening. Next slide. So I wanted to discuss marginalization of trans and non-binary people. Trans and non-binary people not being counted in the US Census plays a huge part in the marginalization of trans people. This discussion has been going on within trans groups, within transgender leadership, and this is a huge concern. Trans and non-binary people should be given the options that they identify within all data collection beyond the census. So the importance of this is an economic thing. Trans and non-binary people were already suffering from economic disadvantages because our community is not counted correctly, thus leaving us out the pool of resources distributed to the country by the federal government, especially trans-led orgs and groups. And I can speak for my own organization. We run a 501c3 organization, and we are concerned about when those census funds are distributed back to the country, to our states, to our counties, and to the areas that we live within, we won't even be thought of as a group to receive these funds. So it's good to understand where the community stands within our own communities economically, to understand our survival mechanisms, our survival things that we are forced to do because of economic disadvantages. Next slide. So the Philadelphia Inquirer did a story. And this was a story that was highlighting transgender women that are sent to men's prisons. This is not just in Philadelphia. This is not just in our cities or counties. This is around the country that our trans women are being sent to men's prisons. And the danger of that, and highlighting the danger of that, is a good story, to be letting our communities know, rather countywide, statewide, and I say that because, we have media everywhere. And if media personnel can, also take the time to talk to their comrades, talk to their people they work beside, sharing that information helps us all. Into understanding the liberation for transgender people in this country, in our state, and in our county. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, transgender inmates, we often, and I am a former inmate some years ago and have had my spent of time in Allegheny County Jail and have firsthand experience of what happens with transgender people within the jail system. And we face additional challenges compared to non-LGBT prisoners. According to Just Detention International, LGBT inmates are among the most vulnerable in the prison population. 67% of LGBT prisoners in California report being assaulted while in prison. The vulnerability of LGBT prisoners has led some prisoners to separate them from other prisoners. And while in others, they are housed with the general population. So, and this turns into a huger conversation And so thankful for our media comrades that do cover these kind of stories, because these kind of stories get thrown away. And while we have transgender inmates within the prison system, within the jail system on minimal charges, you know, again, I discussed surviving within within the economics, right, that we are surrounded with and don't have a part of. So in this instance, while we are closed away from community, we are also experiencing this abuse within the jails by other inmates, by guards, by wardens. These are actual things that are happening. And while we fight, while we are in front of jails, while we are you know, marching and doing protests, we are there to discuss that, to talk about that, and to try to have a dialogue about that. So yeah, and that's what we've been experiencing as far as jail. Next slide. So now I want to jump into defining gender. Excuse me. Defining gender is so huge for all of us to learn. Even me as a trans woman, gender is something that I had to also expand my mind to learn about, you know, different gender identities in the world, and understanding that and respecting people's gender identities. And I want to jump into just these definitions, just to give you some information that you can follow up with. So sex, gender identity, and gender expression. A person's biological traits as they relate to that person's reproductive system, secondary sex characteristics, or generic composition, including physical anatomy, chromosomal sex, and sex assigned at birth. Gender or gender identity. A person's identity as it relates to gender spectrums. Gender expression. Expression of gender identity through appearance, dress, behavior, mannerisms, or other traits. Next slide. And feel free, please leave questions. We will definitely come back to these questions, leave questions for our moderators. And we will get back to those questions when we get through this for the sake of time. So I also want to discuss gender binary. We've heard this term a lot going around. It's been a term, but it's been heightened when we are talking about transgender and non-binary communities. The binary made up of two parts, a system of two parts. Sex and gender binaries assume that there are two often stationary and exclusive options. As you can see here, we have sex and we have intersex here. So intersex, and if you can see on this slide, assigned female at birth, AFAB, assigned male at birth, AMAB. And these are words that are being utilized within community and should also be recognized by our media personnel when reporting on binary communities, non-binary communities, gender identity, non-binary, man and woman, gender expression, feminine, masculine, and androgynous. So if you can understand what we are having is the breakdown of this binary, and understanding that there are genders beyond the binary. Next slide. And we're going to break down those genders. So cisgender, if you haven't heard this word before, denoting or relating to a person whose sense of personal identity and gender corresponds with their sex assigned at birth. The person in this diagram identifies as a cisgender and female. And give you a second to look at this. And we're breaking down sex, gender identity, and gender expression. Next slide. Transgender, denoting or relating to a person whose sense of personal identity and gender does not correspond with their sex assigned at birth. The person in this diagram identifies as transgender and male. And again, breaking down how that works and how that looks. All right, next slide. So non-binary. I have to admit, and I want to be understanding because, you know, we all have to learn new things. And as a transgender woman who identified as a binary transgendered woman previously, learning what, you know, being non-binary is and understanding was huge for me as a trans person. And I say that because it's huge for a lot of people, right? It's huge for a lot of people who live within a binary structure to think of outside of the binary. And I wanted to share that because, you know, a lot of us, even trans people, had to take a second to learn about these different genders within our communities, even under the trans umbrella, which we will talk about later. But non-binary, an umbrella term for genders that fall somewhere in the middle of or beyond the gender spectrums and are neither strictly male or female. This can be used as a gender identification without further explanation. Most people, including most transgender people, are either male or female. But some people don't neatly fit into the categories of man or woman, or male or female. For example, some people have a gender that blends elements of being a man or a woman, or a gender that is different than either male or female. Some people don't identify with any gender. Some people's gender changes over time. People whose gender is not male or female use many different terms to describe themselves, with non-binary being one of the most common. Other terms include genderqueer, agender, bigender, and more. None of these terms mean exactly the same thing, but all speak to an experience of gender that is not simply male or female. Next slide. I want to dive into what I brought up earlier, the trans and non-binary umbrella. Within the trans and non-binary community, there is continually expanding gender diversity. For a growing list of terms and identities, referenced handouts you will receive after this event. Always use the term your source identifies, you know, for themselves. You know, make it apparent to, and we'll discuss this later as well, but as pronouns. I know this has been a common practice. I know we've all been on a million Zoom calls as of late. And a common practice of the Zoom calls that I've been a part of and thankful for, especially when cisgender folk are running the Zoom calls, are what's your name, what's your pronoun. That allows for trans folk to, you know, identify themselves if they want to in the space with their name and their preferred pronouns. As you can see, we have an umbrella. And this is breaking down the trans umbrella and what is up under the trans umbrella. We have trans, and these are terminologies that we're going to talk about later on as well. Trans, transgender, M to F, which is male to female, transgender, trans woman, transsexual, which we don't use any longer. That is actually a slur. So we're not going to want to be using that word when describing transgender people. Transmasculine, F to M, female to male. Transfeminine, trans man, butch, femme, mask, gender non-binary, like we discussed earlier, gender non-conforming, genderqueer, agender, gender fluid, bigender, gray gender, demigender, polygender, androgynous, gray gender, we had that, gender apathic, Novi gender, intergender, maverick, and two-spirit. So these are examples, just some examples of how trans people identify within our communities. And this it certainly goes beyond even what we have here, right? It expands all the time. If you think about how gender within the non-binary communities, within our trans communities would go. Next slide. All right. So, as I was already discussing prior, we're going to jump into non-binary. The person in this diagram identifies as AMAB, assigned male at birth, and genderqueer. She uses female pronouns. Pronouns will be just one part of a person's gender expression. Each person's diagram will look slightly different, and not every person has a fixed concept of gender. People who are gender fluid may fluctuate between genders, and a person's gender identity may evolve over their lifespan. And I'm gonna just give you a sec to go through, look at that. Next slide. So just some non-binary facts, just to have in your Rolodex, just to be able to share with your comrades, people you work with, people you're around. This is about paying it forward. And again, just thankful for our media personnel that are here with us today to be able to learn these things, to be able to pay it forward, right? And when reporting on transgender people, and transgender and non-binary people. Non-binary people are nothing new. This is something that is maybe new to people who have not taken a dive into educating themselves on these different type of genders. Non-binary people aren't confused about their gender identity or following a new fad. Non-binary identities have recognized for a millennia for cultures and societies around the world. Some, but not all, non-binary people undergo medical procedures to make their bodies more congruent with their gender identity. While not all non-binary people need medical care to live a fulfilling life, it's crucial and even life-saving for many. Most transgender people are not non-binary, as I discussed earlier. While some transgender people are non-binary, most transgender people have a gender identity that is either male or female and should be treated like any other man or woman. As I mentioned earlier about being a trans woman who identified within the binary, and after educating myself as a trans person, as a trans woman, on what non-binary was, I found myself more comfortable in the community of non-binary because I acknowledge that I no longer fit in this binary of male and female. I fit in the non-binary spectrum of being a trans woman. And that allowed me to live in my truth fully without being in the spectrum. And this is not everyone's experience. And I just want to share my lived experience with this. Being non-binary is not the same thing as being intersex either, which a lot of people, get confused. And it's okay. It's okay to be confused. It's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to do these things, but it's how you rectify it after it's done. It's how you actually, put in work to make sure that it's not done or that's not done again. Intersex people have an anatomy or genes that don't fit typical definitions of male and female. Most intersex people identify as either men or women, and non-binary people are usually not intersex. They're usually born with bodies that may fit typical definitions of male and female, but their innate gender identity is something other than male and female. Next slide. So let's roll into some gender myths. There's so much, people who aren't a part of the trans community, the trans and non-binary communities, there's so much you don't know. There's so many myths out there that exist when it comes to, the existence of trans people. And we're going to go through that with some myths. All right. So it's unnatural to be transgender or non-binary is a complete gender myth. Transgender and non-binary people are naturally transgender and non-binary. To not act on these feelings would be unnatural. Forcing trans and non-binary people to hide who they are and causing them great pain. It is the quality of the relationship one has in that is which is significant, not the gender of one partner. This myth also comes from the belief that sexual relationships are formed for the reproduction of children between cisgender males and females only. In all relationships, the decision to have children is complex and needs great consideration. Although many cisgender heterosexuals decide to have children, many do not make the same decision or are unable to have children. On the other hand, many transgender or non-binary people choose to have children or raise children with their partner. Children raised in these families comment that what is most important in a family is being loved and cared for, not the gender, or not what gender is raising the children. Next slide. So gender identity determines sexual orientation or vice versa. So I just want to break these down just so we're all understanding the difference, right? Between gender identity and sexual orientation. Lesbian, gay, and bisexual. These are sexual orientations. Cisgender, transgender, binary, gender identities. Non-binary, gender expansive gender identities. One's gender does not dictate their sexual orientation. Likewise, the gender of someone's partner does not dictate their sexual orientation. The concepts are independent. Someone who identifies as bisexual does not become heterosexual or gay depending on their current partner. Someone who is transgender is not necessarily heterosexual either. So when we are discussing gender and we're discussing sexual orientation, we need to be very clear on the difference between the two. And I realize we have our LGBTQIA plus community. Within that spectrum of communities, we do have the T, which is a gender, which is a gender identity, which should always be recognized as that even within our community, our spectrums, our LGBTQIA plus spectrums. Next slide. So another gender myth, we choose to be transgender. Let me be the first to tell you, we don't. I, as a young child, felt what was going on with me. I didn't quite understand it. We didn't necessarily have the terminology when I was growing up in Pittsburgh. And growing up and learning and being able to be around other trans folk like myself allowed me to garnish the education on what I was feeling, and that what I was feeling is valid. So in what I mentioned here, and I'll just go over this, trans and non-binary youth have feelings at an early age, which evolve and solidify in their adolescence while transitioning into one's adult years. However, the choice is when said person decides to transition medically, which has been demonized within communities trans people live within, especially as youth. When we're talking about medically transitioning, we're talking about HRT, hormone replacement therapy. And with this, and there's been a lot of conversations going, what age should a child be able to, start HRT? How soon should that happen? And these conversations that have been, actively happening. But before HRT is thought of, our youth, our children, they are experiencing this. They are understanding what they are feeling. My organization, we serve these youth. And I'm glad that to this day, we have a space where our transgender and non-binary youth can come to and learn about what they're experiencing, how they're experiencing it, and find resources within our organization, Sisters PGH. So it's been very, very telling to, even in Pittsburgh, that we have vast trans and non-binary communities that we need to be paying attention to and need to be, good reporting on within our city. Next slide. So another gender myth, transgender equals intersex. We kind of went over this earlier as well in an earlier slide, but I want to touch back on this as a gender myth. While some intersex people may identify as having trans experience, and some trans people may also be intersex, these are not the same concepts. Intersex people are born with biological features, DNA, anatomy, biochemistry, etc., that fall beyond the categories of medically prescribed male and female. Many intersex people experience dysphoria due to harmful surgeries and practices intended to prevent the full experience of their natural anatomy. While the trans and non-binary and intersex communities are at times closely connected and allied, intersex people have their own important and unique stories to tell, which need to be told. Figures ranges from 1 to 20 in every 1,000 people born intersex. This figure is hard to analyze as many children are misidentified at birth. And that takes us back to just Western medicine, right? And the idea that males and females are only being born. As you can see, that is not the case. And we need to start diving more into what that looks like. Citywide, again, citywide, statewide, countrywide, worldwide. Next slide. So the importance and use of diverse gendered language. It's so important to just be respectful, like we've been talking about in this. Just be respectful of people's gender identities, be respectful of using and having a diverse gendered language in your mind, in your Rolodex, in your notebook, in your notepad. It's important to have these things. Next slide. So pronouns. I talked about pronouns earlier and how, we've all been in these 1,000 Zoom calls as of late, and starting off these Zoom calls with pronouns. One way to support our friends, neighbors, and coworkers is by ensuring we validate their gender through using the correct pronouns. Preferred pronoun is the term used to describe the pronoun that correctly expresses a person's gender. Never assume. Never assume. Assuming gender can lead to misgendering, which is counterproductive and harmful. So never assume that because what you see and appear to be a man, don't assume it or that person to be a man. Don't assume that person to identify as being a man, and vice versa. Always ask. When meeting someone new, ask for their preferred pronouns, even if you think you know. And try to get it right. Once you know a person's preferred pronouns, always make your best effort to use them when speaking to or about that person. And I want to go back to another thing I mentioned. It's okay to make a mistake. We all make mistakes. It happens. But when that is right, or you are told about the mistake that you have made, it is then up to you to correct that behavior. Recognizing mistakes. When you misgender someone, apologize and accept responsibility for using correct pronouns moving forward. It's so important. It's not hard. It's not hard to listen to a person's, they tell you what their pronouns are. It's not hard to call them the pronouns. Next question. All right, next slide. So gender expansive pronouns. Now, these are just a few pronouns you might encounter in everyday interactions. he, him, his, himself. And these are, we're going along. So he is are great. She's great. So if we're looking at this in different gender expansive pronouns, and I want to take a second just for everyone to get to dialogue what's here. We're breaking down that gender expansive or these gender expansive pronouns in ways that may differ from what you have been exposed to in your day-to-day living. So to this second row here, I love him, I love her, I love them, I love him, I love Zier, I love here, I love them. And we're looking at these. And this is a gender, and I keep saying it, but a gender expansive languages that we can be using day to day, depending, again, on people's preferred pronouns. So taking time to go through these things is so beneficial for yourself. It's beneficial for the community. It's beneficial when you're out there reporting with people and you hear these different pronouns. Today, we are being able to provide you with this information that we can continue to provide you with moving forward. Next slide. So other gender language. When writing and speaking gendered nouns are often present, even when we don't expect them. So always opt for a gender neutral alternative when speaking generally and when gender is unknown. So for example, if you are approaching someone, you are unsure what their gender pronouns are, just say they or them, hey, you know, things that are not gendered to avoid these cases. Gender is a spectrum. Rather than categorizing people by gender, speak first to their wants and needs. For example, use people who are pregnant rather than pregnant women. A few examples of gender neutral alternatives we have here. Man, woman, person. Boy, girl, child. Mr., Ms., Miss. Dear sir, dear madam, dear reader, citizen, resident, anchorman, anchorwoman, anchor. So these are just breaking down how we do not have to gender everything, every person. We can actually, you know, coexist in a world where we can use this type of language. Next slide. So practices to avoid, and we've been going over this. Misgender, to refer to using a word that does not correctly reflect the gender with which they identify. Dead name, a name that a person no longer uses and does not reflect their identity. And dead name, to use a person's dead name to refer to them. We want to avoid these things. Next slide. So I'm going to jump into media portrayal of trans people, and we are looking at our clock here. All right, so media portrayal of trans people, trans and non-binary people. Next slide. So what impact does this have on trans and non-binary, on the trans and non-binary community? Trans and non-binary people who are dead named and misgendered within media are at risk of being attacked when they're in their neighborhood, prison system, if they're homeless, they're in shelter, and just their daily living activities like work and school. So when we are, when trans people are, you know, misgendered or dead named publicly, that is actively putting us in danger by those who may want to target us because we're already being targeted as a community. And those that may not know we are transgender or non-binary and have a phobia against our communities. Most trans and non-binary students report a dropout or a drop in GPA due to harassment because of the influence of media, how they portray, or you know, how trans people are being portrayed in the media. And this is not to say anyone particular, right? This is generally speaking. but that influence that our children or youth, those in school, media has a huge role in the development, right, of our kids, because our kids pay attention to media. And when our youth are seeing within media that we are being misrepresented, it causes all kinds of mental health issues that does not allow them to thrive in spaces like school. And as I just mentioned, so just media example of misgendering, and we'll go into that. Next slide. So I want to go over this. This was very recent. This just happened and a Black trans man was killed by the police in Tallahassee, Florida. Oh my gosh. This is something our trans community is dealing with right now. I mean, we are actively losing trans people. We just lost another trans woman in McKeesport, Aliyah Johnson. And I just want to speak her name into this space in case any of our media will be covering that story that happened in McKeesport with Aliyah, to please use her proper pronouns. Please use her name as she is known as Aliyah Johnson. And I just want to put that in this space. But the case of Tony McDade, police say the suspect, an adult, and this is how it was presented on the report, an adult African-American woman was last seen running away from the scene, and a description of the suspect was provided to responding officers who were arriving in the area. Not long after police say they found a woman who matched the description of the stabbing suspect in the 2500 block of Houghton Street. Tallahassee Police Department says the woman identified by police as a 30-year-old Tony McDade on Thursday. And they mentioned that he was armed with a gun. And we're going to go over this video here.
Well, Ben, Julie, I've been here on this scene since a little before noon today when it was still an active crime scene. Now the scene is officially cleared by Tallahassee PD, and they are confirming that one woman is dead after an officer-involved shooting that happened earlier today here on Houghton Street. Police say they initially responded to a stabbing a few blocks away on Saxon Street. TPD says the suspect fled the scene on foot, and according to Tallahassee Police Chief Lawrence Revel, the responding officer saw a woman who matched the description of the suspect in the stabbing. One of the officers approached the woman who said she was armed, and police say she pointed a gun at the officer, and the officer fired his weapon, fatally shooting the woman. Now, the officer involved in the shooting is now placed on administrative leave, and the investigation will be turned over to the state attorney.
All right. So the case of Tony McDade, as of recent, we just did some investigating, on Twitter. My organization was reached out to about this case, about this story, about, the news naming and misgendering this man during a time. There's just so many answers, or so many questions, and answers not answers provided. And I just wanted to highlight some things that are happening right now. Again, this has just happened. We're all feeling this within our trans communities, or our allies, our comrades. We're all feeling this. But I wanted to show you how clearly Tony McDade could not be confused as a woman. It is not, and I just want to read a quote here for Rick. It is not the witness' fault. He didn't know Tony, and we'll go over that. And he didn't know his pronouns, but please don't let the media name or misgender him. And these are active questions, and this just takes some report back to those loved ones, report back to those that knew our trans and non-binaries communities, whether that's biological family, our chosen family. Understand that we also, a lot of times, have chosen family because we are ostracized away from our biological family members. So it's always worth touching base, connecting with each and every person that you physically can, to make sure that the gender of a person, the name of a person is respected. And in this case is still unfolding. I've been very involved in keep learning about what's going on here, but it was found that Tony did not have a gun in this case. And the police officer is on administrative leave right now, of course, while the investigation is going on. But it's worth always touching base with the family, the friends, the chosen family that is surrounded, by us. And understanding that, thank you, and understanding that when we, when we tell you, our gender identities, just respect that. So before and after images are often unnecessary at best and harmful at worst. Never ask the comparison pictures. When discussing a person's transition, use imagery that is uplifting rather than victimizing. Next slide. So many trans people are proud of their lives and accomplishments before transition, but always allow the subject to control their story and the decision to use pictures from before transitioning. Avoid side-by-side comparisons. Allow the person to tell you their story. Okay. So just some tips for reporting and interviewing. Next slide. So language is important. Use chosen identities rather than describing your version of someone's narrative. So for example, Susan identifies as a trans woman. Susan was born a man. Treat all chosen names equally. And just for the sake of time, because I know we're running on some minutes here, avoid cliches and headlines. Transgender is an adjective. Do not use it as a noun or a verb. So transgendered, not a word. Justin Smith, a transgendered woman, is 27 years old, or Justine. Justine Smith, a transgender is 27 years old. Justine Smith, a transgender woman, is 27 years old. So we're going to want to stick to that, that language we're using on that third bubble there. So consider the whole person. Move beyond the coming out narrative. Avoid hyper-focus of medical questions or on medical questions. Integrate trans and non-binary people across reporting. Trans and non-binary people are likely to have unique and important insights into several issues such as healthcare services and access, intersectional discrimination, income inequality and poverty, legislation, arts and media, and many more things that could be considered. So getting it right or getting it wrong and right. So we're looking at this report here, and we discussed prior, transgendered. No, even the best intentioned and knowledgeable authors can make mistakes, and it's totally cool. This author used transgendered instead of transgender. The author uses pronouns correctly. The author recognizes McConnell as a man. The author moves beyond the coming out narrative and discusses trans people as parents and citizens with any interest in public policy. So again, I just want to highlight, it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay. It's just about, fixing those mistakes. Next slide. So just reporting with respect. Reporters should use the pronoun preferred by the individuals who have acquired the physical characteristics of the opposite sex or present themselves in a way that does not correspond with their sex at birth. If that preference is not expressed, and if unfamiliar using pronouns, they, them. Media outlets often gratuitously and sensationally focus on transgender person's body, surgery, and other medical treatment. And their changing appearance, please consider, instead of telling the deeper stories of courage, struggle, and other experiences that make up a transgender person's full human experience, if referring to medical treatment, do so using terminology in the GLAAD guide. And we're going to also provide you with that. And thank you so much, GLAAD, for assisting us and being here with us today. Always ask. Include SOGI and pronoun questions. Include SOGI and pronouns questions with your regular demographic questions. Don't fear asking sources how they identify in sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression, and exclude it as a part of your routine. It is better to ask than assume and get it wrong. So we'll go to the next slide. So now we're going to go to a poll. If everyone could just take the time, a quick second, and answer on this poll, and we're going to break that down. How often do you ask others, including sources, about their preferred pronouns? 2, how often do you identify your preferred pronouns to others? And I want to just give everyone a second to answer those. All right. And this is what we have. So how often do you ask others, including sources, about their preferred pronouns? We have 13%, and never really, 62% at sometimes, most of the time and always at 26%. How often do you identify your preferred pronouns for others? We have never, rarely, 21%, sometimes 59%, and most of the time and always 21%. So as we can see from what we have here with you folks visiting with us today, and again, thank you for coming and being with us today and learning these things. We need to definitely make most of the time and always a higher percentage in our day-to-day interactions with trans folk. So, and this just goes to show, the work that needs to be done, but I believe that that work can be done, especially with conversations like this, right? So, move on. So, applied topic, reporting crime, suspects, and victims. Consider rather transgender status is relevant. If not, exclude. Here's some examples. Man and women's clothing walking down Penn Avenue. Transgender woman walking down Penn Avenue. Woman walking down Penn Avenue. Continue to use chosen names. Here's an incorrect example. John Smith, who goes by the name Justine, is 27 years old. The correct way to put that, Justine Smith is 27 years old. Provide context. It's always great to provide context. The suspect was identified as Justine Smith by neighbors, but was identified as John Smith by police. Advocates say many transgender people are unable to legally change their name or obtain corrected identification documents. Yeah, next slide. All right. So being an ally or an accomplice. All right. So everyday ways to support gender diversity. So promote pronoun clarity by giving yours in your email signature or when you introduce yourself to people. Again, it's about paying it forward to those around us. Make space for trans and non-binary voices within your spaces. Challenge intolerant remarks and behavior about trans and non-binary people. Share resources with your colleagues and editors when they have limited knowledge. Just listen to your trans and non-binary friends to better understand their experience. And if you don't have trans and non-binary friends, reach out to folks like sisters or reach out to folks doing work in the community around our trans communities. Openly acknowledge when your knowledge is limited. So yeah, next slide. All right, so now we're going to pop into our gender awareness in the media panel discussion, and I'll let Jen
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Ciora. That was really, really informative. We're gonna move over to our gender awareness in the media panel, and we have several panelists here with us today. Of course, we already know Ciora, who uses she, her, hers, or they, them, their. And she is still the director and founder of Sisters Pittsburgh, along with many other positions across the community. We have Kristina Marusic, who uses she, her, hers, and she's the Pittsburgh reporter for the national nonprofit digital publication Environmental Health News, as well as the co-founder and co-president of the Pittsburgh chapter of the Association of LGBTQ Journalists. We have Rachel Lange, who uses they, them, theirs. And Rachel is a freelance writer and educational materials developer who also serves as the editor of QueerPGH, a local online magazine by and for the LGBTQIA+ community in Pittsburgh. We have Meg Fair, a local reporter here in Pittsburgh. And we also have Russ Murray, who is the Senior Director of Education and Training at the GLAAD Media Institute. So we have just a huge wealth of both community knowledge and professional knowledge, and we're ready to get started and get into some questions. Thank you guys all so much for being here. I'm going to start off with a couple of prepared questions, but of course we also have questions from our audience, both those that submitted earlier and those that have been submitting throughout the webinar. So my first question, and I'm going to direct this to Kristina. So we talked a little bit during the training portion about the difference between sexual orientation and gender identity and expression. But sometimes this concept can get confusing, hard to internalize because we live in a society that frequently groups them together. One of the attendees said, we use this acronym LGBTQIA+, and we're kind of already lumping everyone in together. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists, starting with Kristina, can you tell me, what's the difference? How do you conceptualize the difference between gender identity and sexual orientation? And how should reporters really navigate asking sources about both? What if they feel like they're being invasive?
Sure. So I generally think of the difference between gender identity and sexual orientation as gender identity is how you identify yourself, and your sexual orientation is who you're attracted to. So for me, for example, my gender identity is that I'm a woman, and my sexual orientation is that I identify as bisexual and queer. And one mistake that a lot of people in general, and that includes reporters, make, and this includes members of the LGBTQ community, is assuming someone's sexual orientation is defined by their gender identity and the gender identity of their current partner or their partners in general. Excuse me. So for example, my partner is a straight cisgender man, and so people regularly look at us as a couple and incorrectly assume that I'm straight. I have a colleague who is, and good friend who is a woman who is married to another woman, so people regularly assume that she is a lesbian, but we are both bisexual, and that remains true no matter what the gender identity of our partner is. So this overlooking of bi people's sexual orientation is referred to as bisexual erasure. It's a big problem for the bi+ community, and the media can play a really important role in helping to change that by recognizing the difference between gender identity and sexual orientation and making sure to get things right. And this is specifically relevant for the trans and non-binary communities. A national survey found that around 42% of trans people identify as bisexual or queer. So this is something that I think is important to take into consideration anytime your source's gender identity or sexual orientation is important enough to include in a story.
Any other panelists want to chime in?
This is Ross from GLAAD, and first of all, thank you very much for holding this and for inviting us to be a part of it. Ciora, the presentation that you gave was wonderful, and I think that's really educational, informative. One way when I've done presentations like this for newsrooms or media outlets or anyone is also remind people, especially well-meaning folks that want to do it right, is to remind us that we all have a sexual orientation and we all have a gender identity. I think a common assumption sort of is that sexual orientation is for gays and lesbians and bisexuals, and that gender identity is for transgender, non-binary people, but that heterosexual, straight is a valid sexual orientation as much as the other ones, and that cisgender is a valid gender identity just as much as a trans or non-binary identity is. And I think when people get that understanding, if they've never had to think, oh, I have a sexual orientation, I have a gender identity, but I've never had to think about it, it makes it easier for them to understand that someone else has done some discerning or thinking about identifying either who they are or what kind of people they want to be forming relationships with.
Yeah. Those are really great points. The same attendee asked, should we reconsider the use of the term LGBTQIA+? Do we have any thoughts on that one? Rachel. Remember to unmute yourself.
Sorry. It's important not to use it when you're talking about a part of the abbreviation or the initialism. Like, it's important to, if you really are talking to, for example, gay men, and you use it, you're talking about everybody. So when you're talking about everybody, use it. If you're not talking about everybody, if you're specifically focusing on trans issues, for example, that's not the whole community. If you're specifically talking about gay men, that's not the whole community. So be careful to use it when appropriate.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off, thank you for that, Rachel. Yeah, because I've seen it used a lot, just in reports of talking about a trans person and clumping in like LGBTQIA community, when it's not, like, they're not a part of that whole entire community. So yeah, being specific on that, I second that. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think if I could jump in, it is important to think about why everybody is lumped in together in that kind of acronym. Part of it has to do with the fact that that LGBTQIA+ is a group of people who often have to work together in coalitions despite having different issues and different problems, because larger society does kind of lump all those things together. But it is really important, like everyone has said so far, don't just use that if that's not relevant to the topic that you're talking about, especially when, which that's a whole other conversation, a lot of times trans people and non-binary people have really had to fight for space in the LGB part of that community. So that's also something to like think about. And if you are a reporter and you don't have a nuanced knowledge or even like a base knowledge of queer history and trans history, that's something that I think maybe might be worth exploring for you.
Yeah.
Can I add to that? I think one thing that GLAAD has done is some polling and surveys. And a few years ago, one of our surveys talked about the different generational awareness of diverse sexual orientations and gender identities. And one thing we found was that the youngest, it's hard to say generation, it was 18 to 34-year-olds, so kind of crossing a couple generations, were much more aware of diverse sexual orientation, gender identities, not just gay as kind of a lump all for an entire community. And they're more likely to identify with this bigger, broader community, but they probably aren't using those specific terms they're not all gay, right? They're not all lesbian, they're not all bisexual. They're going to use more diverse terms like the umbrella slide that you had, Ciora, that had just a variety of gender identity terms, which means the acronym, I mean, this is one thing for us to sort of prepare for as a society. The acronym potentially could continue to grow and expand and grow and expand, or we are going to find other ways that we describe who we are, right? And how we see and understand ourselves and how we relate to the world. And I think that's one thing as media is going to help people see that, help people understand it, and probably transition into that, because we've gone from like single word lump terms like gay to mean everything and everyone to an acronym that admittedly can get a little unwieldy, and recognizing that people might have to take more than a single word to sum up who they are and how they relate to the world.
Absolutely. So the next question that I have is coming directly to Meg to start, but obviously for the whole panel. So, you know, I identify as a transmasculine person myself, but I've noticed in my life that I've really struggled with certain concepts. Specifically for me, it's been gender neutral pronouns. And I practice it on my own and I, you know, try to get myself better. But, you know, I'm wondering, you know, if you know someone or you yourself have struggled with something, you know, how have you worked through it, and or how have they worked through it? And then what do you suggest when you actually make the mistake that we're all horrified of making?
Yeah, so as someone who's in the position of being a reporter who is also gender nonconforming, it's important to point out that I've goofed up before. Like, it's something when you're reporting, especially if it's like a hard news story on a deadline, if you aren't actively forcing yourself to think about following all of the protocol to make sure that you're not making a mistake, it is possible to make mistakes. It's important always, if you goof up, to apologize. But the best thing that you can do in addition to that is not make the mistake again. Because that shows that your apology wasn't like, oops, I did that in front of you, and that probably made you feel bad. It's saying, look, I see you now, I've got it right, I'm not gonna mess it up again. I think that for me personally, the best thing that we can do to normalize making space for gender nonconforming people is to make sure that in your email signature or whatever, you have your pronouns, whether you're cis, whether you're trans, whether you're gender nonconforming. I just think that's good practice. It makes it feel less weird. If you're the only person in the newsroom with your pronouns in your email signature, as I have been before, it can be a little bit awkward because you definitely feel like the odd one out. But I think honestly, the most important thing when you make a mistake is to be apologetic, not make the mistake moving forward, and also make sure when you are apologizing, not to frame it in a way that makes the person who you misgendered feel like they owe you an apology or have to comfort you, because that is something that I think sometimes happens. Like, you goof up and you feel like you need to like atone or something, but that's just like highly uncomfortable as the person on the other end of that. So the best thing you can do is just be like, I'm so sorry, it won't happen again, and to not let it happen again.
Yeah, that's really great advice. Yeah, Rachel. Don't forget to unmute yourself.
Just to support what Meg said, I use they, them, but I make mistakes too. I've made mistakes before. I think for me, just moving right along, if you're writing things down, you have the time to edit. Two other tips, if you can include pronouns on things like office signs and name tags, that can go a long way to reminding people to use them. That's it.
Yeah, you know, someone in the audience proposed a question. I've heard both Meg and Rachel say the word pronouns as opposed to preferred pronoun. What do we think about the term preferred pronoun? Is that outdated? Is it implying that this person has a choice? Kristina, I see you wanting to add to that.
Yeah, that was actually the example I had thought of to talk about making a mistake, which is one time I was interviewing a source, and if I plan to include someone's sexual orientation, gender identity in a story, if it's relevant enough to include, I just ask at the top of the interview, you know, may I ask your sexual orientation? May I ask your gender identity? May I ask your pronouns. Now I say pronouns, but originally when I started doing this and I thought I was doing such a great job, I asked someone, a source, to tell me their preferred pronouns, and they really bristled. They were like, they're not my preferred pronouns, they're just my pronouns. And I felt really like embarrassed and weird. I thought I was being proactive, and it hadn't occurred to me that that was, you know, a problematic phrase. And so I had that initial reaction of feeling like embarrassed and bad. And I kind of worked to process it quickly during the interview and said, you know, you're right, I haven't thought of it that way before. I will just use pronouns from now on. I don't know why I need to add preferred. And so that was one of those times where I just kind of like apologized and moved forward, and then also changed what I did, because, you know, after thinking about it, I was like, yeah, why do we need to make a distinction?
Yeah, Ciora, you were gonna say something.
Just to piggyback off of that, even when I first heard like the term preferred pronouns, I was kind of going along with it. And just to be like transparent, I was kind of going along with it, like, oh, this is pretty cool. Until like I really broke it down, like, wait, it's being questioned if these are my pronouns. And that's when I was like, yeah, this is not going to work. I don't know who coined it, but I'm glad that coin is gone and it's just pronouns. So.
Yeah, I think to piggyback off of that, like, I think sometimes preferred implies optional.
Right.
And you don't want to leave that space, because that's like, I don't know, it's like asking someone like, oh, your name is Nicholas, like, do you go by Nicholas? And the person's like, no, my name is Nick. And you're like, all right, Nicholas, like, it's just like you wouldn't. And so, yeah, very glad that we're kind of switching over into like, what are your pronouns, rather than leaving it as like a preference.
Yeah, those are really great points. Oh, Rachel.
If you're cisgendered, try it on for yourself. Like, ask, you know, imagine someone asking, so do you prefer to be known as a man? Because I prefer chocolate ice cream, but I can deal with strawberry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
absolutely.
Prefer.
Absolutely. So earlier, and this question is coming directly to you, Rachel. Kristina mentioned bi-erasure, and Meg alluded to, you know, non-binary people having to fight to be portrayed in the media. This kind of leads us to the idea of non-binary erasure. When we see people who are outside of what we usually have in our socially constructed norms, the boxes that we all have been socialized to accept, being erased from the story. Rachel, can you give any examples of how this plays out in the media and how we can combat it?
Well, first of all, we need more representation. The only representation I had in the media growing up was Pat from Saturday Night Live, and let me tell you, that's not flattering. I think the best thing that media professionals can do is, as Ciora has already pointed out, don't assume you know. Gender expression is different from gender identity. I present sometimes very female, and I present sometimes very masculine. So people misgender me both times. And you know, I kind of move on, but you know, it's awkward. So don't assume just because someone is, I don't know, wearing a dress that you know that they identify as female. Ask. The other thing that really concerns me, and Ciora mentioned this as well, is that you need to make sure that if you do any data collection, if you conduct any surveys, that you do include an other gender option, whether that's non-binary, and use that as sort of an umbrella, or leave an option for other where people can write in, because there really isn't very much data on non-binary people. And we don't know how common we are. And I suspect, I mean, maybe it's just my Facebook feed, but a lot more people are coming to terms with a non-binary identity. And it's worth knowing. This information is not that easy to gather. you got to answer your census, but it's not optional. You know, it's not an option on the census, for example. That's our biggest data collection tool. So make sure to ask your sources. Make sure to, if you are doing any kind of survey work or anything like that, make sure to include that as an option. One of the weirdest examples is with all this COVID stuff, how there are 0 non-binary cases. Well, that's because hospitals aren't asking. That's because it's not an option on a lot of medical forms. So I very much doubt that there are 0 non-binary cases and that we're somehow immune, but I don't know, who knows? We don't.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to definitely open this question up to the rest of the panel, but you mentioned Pat, and that kind of got me thinking about a question that someone else brought up earlier, which is, you know, I know that I, you know, as a trans person, am extremely grateful to people who really push the boundaries early on, people like Divine or like RuPaul, who really set the precedent in media to see other gender expressions. But can we talk a little bit about how has the earlier representation of gender diversity kind of affected our narrative now? And do we see an effect still? And can we talk about it a little bit? I see Ross nodding.
Yeah, I can talk about this because I think I heard a director talk about a term that I kind of like. It's been called problematic progress. It was filming a documentary about kind of representation in film and television and saying that, you know, and there's a generational divide here. An older lesbian was supervising a very young queer editor who was watching Soap and Billy Crystal's portrayal. And the young queer editor said, like, this is the worst thing I've ever seen. And the old lesbian said, no, this was like the best groundbreaking thing that there was. And so I think one thing that we recognize is that we as a society progress and we learn more and we expand more and recognize that the stuff that was really good and groundbreaking and got us to the point that we are today doesn't meet the standards where we are today. Glad we recognize outstanding LGBTQ media representation, and we acknowledge things that we have said was outstanding 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 15 years ago wouldn't be wouldn't be considered outstanding today. Partly because, you know, tropes exist, because the same thing gets done and said over and over and over again. Ciora put it as a part of the presentation. You know, there's been a practice for transgender people. There's an over focus on bodies and medical procedures and surgeries. And one case we sort of said is just like, that's been done enough. There are plenty of other stories that you're ignoring while you're still focusing on this thing that's been, you know, overdone. And so I think one thing that we can do is push something that's new and innovative and groundbreaking. And that's going to be helpful for the media. One way that I talk about it when I talk to reporters, if we're talking about ourselves, we might complain, this has never been covered. This story never has been told, right? And that's a complaint with my friends and my peers. If I talk to a media outlet, I will say the same thing, but the tone is different. This has never been covered. You could be the first one to do it. You could be the person that tells the story that's never been heard, and then you get to be, you know, the hero, the first, the one that can get that representation. I think that's an incentive to listen to what we're saying is not being told or not being represented and say, okay, I want to help tell those stories. I want to be someone who's going to share someone's story. I think that's important, and it's especially important role for media, whether it's journalism or entertainment or elsewhere.
Yeah. Kristina.
I also just wanted to mention that while we've talked about the importance of using the labels that people use to describe themselves, that sometimes you might, as a reporter, get pushback from an editor. So if it's an identity term that your editor hasn't heard of that someone's using, they might say, well, that's under the trans umbrella. Can you just refer to this person as trans? Or that's under, you know, the bi plus umbrella. Can we just refer to this, you know, your editor has never heard of the term omnisexual. So they say, can you just call them bi? And I wanted to talk about some strategies just a little bit for talking to your editors about that, because that can be challenging. You know, it presents an opportunity to be an ally to the community by making it clear how important it is that people get to label themselves, and that we get into a lot of hot water when we start putting labels on other people who didn't choose them. So it's an opportunity to refer your editor to organizations like GLAAD and other organizations that have style guides available, best practices. In that instance, your editor, you can offer to your editor to define the term and use a definition that comes from a trusted source like GLAAD or another media resource, and we're going to send out some handouts after this with lots of links to options for those. But it's really important to advocate, to push back against an editor saying, well, that word isn't in our style guide, or our readers won't know what that means. Can we just swap it out for something else? To say, it's really important that we honor our sources by using the terms that they use to describe themselves, and find ways to define those terms, because that's also a benefit to readers. That's really doing your duty as a journalist to educate your readers.
Absolutely. Yeah, Meg.
To add on to that, that's like such great advice, especially if you're like dealing with an editor. I think another thing, which maybe is counterintuitive to this conversation, is it's always best practice to get people's pronouns to make sure that you are portraying them correctly. But if you are not writing a story about identity, if you're not writing a story about the topic of, someone's advocating for rights or something like that, like if you're talking to a trans person who's a florist, you don't have to be like, and you're writing a story about like the Rose Bowl, right? Or like the parade. You don't have to be like, this like flower artist who identifies as so-and-so and uses such and such pronouns has been working on growing. Like if it has nothing to do with the story, you absolutely alienate the person that you are reporting on. And also it hitches up the reader of the story, because instead of being like, oh, I'm reading a story about this person who is, working on a float for a parade and doing this ornate flower art, instead they're like, oh, that was like a weird thing. And then the whole time they're just like still trying to recover from the very strange, obtuse sentence that like wasn't necessary. And as far as pronouns go, if you ever butt up against an editor who wants you to clarify someone's identity because they're using they, them pronouns, the AP Style Guide, which is the journalism Bible, allows the use of a singular they. And the singular they has been used in conversation for a long time. So if that is something you can be like, hey, it's not just me. I don't have an agenda. I'm literally following the style guide that I studied in college or like I trained on, And so I think that is really important to think about as you're, approaching topics.
Yeah, and Rachel, remember to unmute yourself.
Just to add on to that a note about style guides, there's a reason other than money that they release a new one every year, because style guides have to reflect where society is. Read a newspaper from 50 years ago and it's going to be grading. Mm-hmm. They change. We no longer put two spaces after a period. Things happen.
Yeah, and I've heard almost all of the panelists allude to this concept. This is the next question. It's coming right to Ciora. There are stories out there about trans and non-binary people that are not being told. And there are stories that, reflect the rich and the deep experience of the community. What are some of the stories out there that we don't get to hear, but really need someone to put them out there for us?
Yeah, so the first thing that comes to mind is the amount of, especially Black trans women that are being killed in our state, and are like, that's actively happening. And the coverage of that could do so much good in making sure that it's rectified statewide, and hopefully that to be modeled around the country, because it's not getting attention like it needs to get. We see lately that, the killings that are happening now with Black cisgender folk, it gets highlighted so hugely in media, but when a Black trans person is killed, that does not get the exposure that it's supposed to get. So this mixed. I mean, I'm not a reporter. I'm looking at it from the constituent stance, like from the person who's going to pick up the paper and read it. And we don't see the coverage like it should be. And we've been screaming about that forever about, you know, how we are not getting this main media coverage and not just with death, with life as well. There are a lot of trans folk and non-binary folk doing amazing things in the world that should be acknowledged to the masses, to for everyone to know and be able to support. And so these kind of things should definitely be happening in media. And it's really sad to see, and it's deafening, it's erasing us when we don't see ourselves in the media like we should be in the media being talked about. So I know that's one thing that has really stuck out to me. Another thing is portraying us as prostitutes or these horrible people in the world when we, like I discussed in the slides, we are faced with economic disadvantages that forces us into sex work. We don't use the term prostitute anymore. We use the term sex workers now. And there's other terms, but prostitute is just not one of those terms that is being used. So, and when we see ourselves in the media, I remember there has been instances everywhere where, you know, trans people are plastered on the front of media pages, calling them a prostitute, drug addict, arrested and sent off to jail, into the men's prison or into the women's, whatever that looks like. And I talked about that earlier and how damaging that is for not only trans folk, trans and non-binary folk, but for the community who's looking for education from the media. And this provides the media a good time, a huge service to the community to provide accurate education to people so that we can begin creating safe places for trans people within their own communities. There's so many of us that have to move out of our own communities because of safety. So if we started feeding education back into these communities, and from my experience, predominantly Black and Brown communities that are hugely affected and does not have the education that my community needs to access and communicate with trans and non-binary Black people. So that would be huge.
Yeah, absolutely. Ross, go ahead.
I wonder, just in terms, I do like the idea of saying what stories haven't been told and what's been underreported, because I think a lot about the trans community has been underreported, and the stuff that Ciora mentioned is big. I would also say, just to point out for folks, a kind of a bigger picture thing, there's been several legal actions that have been taken either in states or federally that have specifically targeted the trans community. So a couple things I'll just mention here. One of the more high profile ones was reinforcing a ban on transgender people serving in the military, who actually tend to serve higher than cisgender people, the rates of service. And so targeting to either expel or prevent them from enrolling. Several directives that have gone through things like the Department of Health and Human Services that has created definitions for sex and gender that preclude or erase out the existence of transgender people, and making it easier for doctors to refuse to provide healthcare, and I'm saying doctors, medical professionals, pharmacists to refuse to provide healthcare. Not even just related to transition-related care, but healthcare in general. And then some very specific state ones. One of the big ones that came up this year was targeting high school athletes in specific states, and a number of states introduced bills that would ban trans students from competing on high school sports teams. It passed in Idaho. I think that's the only state that it passed in, was defeated in other states. And then other ones that were starting to criminalize doctors or parents that are supporting transgender children as well, that can make treating, providing transition-related care from a doctor, which is what the Medical Association recommends making that a felony, and perhaps in some states having the parents be reported to a version of Child Protective Services. And so these things have continued to come up in state legislatures. A lot of this got interrupted because of coronavirus, but I think that reporters are really wise to keep an eye on that, because whenever the next legislative session comes, there's probably gonna be other versions of those same things. And those bills look very identical to each other. So someone is feeding these bills out to legislatures across the country.
Yeah, thanks, Ross. Those are really important to keep an eye on. I think we want to be respectful of everyone's time, so we're going to end it there. But I want to thank all of our panelists so much. You know, we really appreciate how much knowledge, community knowledge, and professional knowledge you guys have added to the discussion. And it's been really, really great to talk with you, and I really appreciate you guys being here. We're going to turn it over now to Ciora to give us some final words.
All right. So yeah, I just want to thank all of our panelists for being here with us today, taking the time to really dive into an important conversation, you know, with our media outlets. It's so important that we're able to do this now and continue doing this, you know, in the future. And of course, thank you to all of our media outlets that attended today with us. We appreciate your work and your work moving forward to learn these different identities in the world. So we hope this was helpful. And again, thank you so much. And thank you so much to the Human Relations Commission. And yeah, thankful.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ciora, and thank you to Sisters. Thanks to the Transgender Coalition of PA. And thank you to the Mayor's LGBTQIA+ Advisory Council. For all of the attendees, we'll be back again next week with a discussion about gender awareness in Pittsburgh overall. You know, how are we as a community doing around this topic, and what do we need to be looking at and changing? All right, guys, we're gonna head out.